So now we can actually talk about our next guy, which is Projector shader. And you can find it here under effects, like all of those. And what it does, it enables you to change the projection inside the material. So imagine that you have a texture applied to your object. And here, let me just put that material on this sphere so we can get that settings. So imagine that you have a projection set here and you are really satisfied with the look. But inside these channels, you put another texture, another shader or image, and this projection simply doesn't work or doesn't look right on the object. And here you have all those settings individually for that image or texture. So you can apply a different projection than this set here for the whole material. It's really useful. So let's clear that guy. The settings for that projection shader are completely the same as here. The next guy we will cover is this Proximal shader. This one is really interesting. Really to show you what Proximal shader can do on a most primitive, simple way, I will put it here on the test plane. And I'll put this sphere a little bit upwards. And here, if you enter the shader, you will see many options. What basically Proximal shader is, it changes the grayscale values of objects when they are close to each other. To put it really simple, if I drag this sphere here in the objects list, let me just do a small test render. And currently you can see that there is a white, sort of a gray spot. And if I pull that sphere a bit down, you will see that that gray spot increased in radius. And that is exactly what that Proximal shader does. So with it you can fake various effects. For example, imagine that you can create a coastline, and here you have an object to use polygon components like vertices and edges. So maybe one usage would be creating a shoreline, or for example you can create rain effects with particles in this Proximal shader. Or imagine that this sphere is some sort of a bullet, and or maybe even a photon torpedo, and that a galactic starship would brighten up as a sort of energetic shield effect or something like that. I hope that makes sense. I'm really trying to explain this as most simple as I can, because procedural shaders are somewhat difficult to grasp at the beginning, but if time is invested in learning them, you can do magnificent results. I'll just clear that shader and go to our next one. And the next guy we have is a ripple shader. And this one is also interesting. And this ripple shader is really designed to work with particles. So let me create a simple particle. Here I can hide this sphere with this little gizmo here. And I can create a simple particle emitter, pull it upwards, and just rotate it down. Particles always come in Z plus orientation. So if I press play now, you will see that particles are coming down. Let me scroll back the time. This really doesn't look like much, but let me pull that emitter here in the particle slot, and in the object slot I will pull this test plane. And let me do a small simulation here, and you will see that these particles go through plane. If I do a preview render, you won't see anything happening. But if you do a test render in the picture viewer with Shift and R, you'll actually see that effect. And what ripple shader does, it creates a grayscale ripple on the object surface. So see, when particle hits, you will get a ripple effect. Currently this shader is loaded in color channel, so it looks a little bit weird. You should reload it in displacement or bump channel. It works best there. And of course, inside the shader you can play with the minimal strength and amount of how fast it is and the amplitude and so on. Okay, so let's cover our next guy. We can go back, we can delete that particle emitter, re-enable our sphere object, and the next guy we have here is a spectral shader. And I will do a small pause in the video and continue with our shaders. So let's continue with our next guy, which is spectral shader, I believe. Let me just check that. Here under effects, yes, spectral guy. Actually, this spectral guy is designed to be used in specular color channel. Because here under specular you can only control the overall appearance of that specular. You don't have the ability to load a shader or texture. You do that here in the specular color channel. So let's load that effect here. So effects, spectral. And let's apply that material here and see what we get if we do a test render. And you can already see that there is some gradation of the colors inside this shader, and this is exactly what is inside. You have a spectrum, which is really a gradient, which you can define colors. For example, I could add some sort of orangey color. And you have many options here. For example, you can increase the intensity to something like 5 maybe, so it will be more pronounced. Here is how the shader will behave when it goes out of range, so it will be mirrored or tiled. But that's not really important. The important settings are here under Use CD Effect. So let's enable that and see what we get here. And I don't know if you can actually see that, but effects is really subtle. You can see it here. So if we go under specular and increase this width a bit, something like 75, it will become more pronounced. I bet you can see it now. So here there are two main controls, like diffuse intensity and diffuse variation. So let's set this to something like maybe 3 and 5 and see what we get. And we get a really pronounced effect. And if we change this to a mirror behavior, we will just see difference. So you can create all sorts of crazy effects, and if you put tiling here you will see a difference. So the best way to understand these shaders is to experiment with them. So let's put a stop here. This looks really nice, and it would be better to show this on a disk object. So I will create a disk object here, disable my render just for a second, and put that up, and simply I can change some settings here so I have as little geometry as I need. So 1, and I can convert it to a polygon object and apply that material. And watch what happens if I render now. You can see that that's sort of a CD effect on this. You can expand on that and add, let's say, a DVD color of some sort. Something like this, and maybe even a reflection, maybe 10% of the reflection, and you can now play with that gradient to get really decent results here. Okay, maybe tune this down a bit. So instead of tutoring you, I'm really playing, so I will skip this part and go to our next guy. I got a bit carried away, so let me delete this. I'll re-enable these hypernerves both in editor and render, and rather create a new material and explain our next guy, which is Spline shader, and this one is really underutilized in Cinema 4D. Maybe even hide this again and show you that on a test plane object. although his name, the spline shader, would suggest it has something to do with splines, it actually does not. So if I apply it here, you will see something has happened. And inside the shader you have many settings. And you can actually write down the text that will be displayed in the shader, and that is so useful. For example, I think this line width is a little bit too big, so let me change to something like 10. I will scale that down. You can scale only in X and Y. So because there is no depth on this letter, so let's say it's something like 20 for both. And maybe I want these letters to be in the middle. So I want to offset them like something like this, and 50 also. It doesn't have to be perfect, just somewhere here in the middle. You can use any type of font that you have installed on your system, and that is extremely useful. The advantage of this spline shader over a regular text object is that it will behave and deform with the surface always without any problems. So let's write here Cinema 4D with a capital D, and we will get this. Let me just offset it a bit so we have it visible in our plane object. And this really doesn't look like much, but what if you put that shader in a displacement channel? So for example, you can create writing in the sand or letters in the sea or something like that. It really has so many usage. And here under background and line texture, you can actually choose a background. So this black becomes something else, and a line texture also becomes something else. And that something else can be a shader of its own, an image, or whatever you choose. So now you're really beginning to grasp how powerful procedural shaders are inside Cinema 4D. We barely scratched the surface yet. Okay, so let me close this, and I'll be back in a second with the next guy.